Hello, welcome. We should have some people starting to join us now. I see that a number of people are starting to join us. That's fantastic. Welcome everybody to the webinar. I'm going to give 1 or 2 minutes for everybody to arrive to join us. We have a sold out webinar today. We have a version of Zoom that allows us to have 100 participants. The option to purchase 500 participants was unfortunately a bit too steep for us this time around. So we hope to find other tools in the future to allow more people to join with us during the live webinar. But we are recording. It's going to be available after the end of the webinar so that anybody can come back and view it later, or you can share it. We'll continue to take questions after the fact as well. So anybody that's watching this later, please feel free to send us a question. There is a hashtag on Twitter, #SciWebinar. There you can find comments of those that are watching live during the webinar itself, and you can come back later and ask questions yourself if you're watching this from the recording. See that people are still streaming in. We've got about half of our registered participants are with us now. You'll see that as you entered with your video off and yourself on mute. We're going to be keeping everybody on mute during this webinar. What we would like you to do is to make use of the Q&A tool. So at the bottom, slightly right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A feature that we're asking everybody to use during this webinar. If you have a question for a specific speaker, we give them an @ sign and then their name, so we know to direct that question to that speaker. Or if you have a more general question, you can just ask that more general question. If you see a question that you really like, you can vote it up. At the very end of the webinar, I'll be taking questions and answers in one time slot at the end. So first I'll direct any questions specifically to the speakers in the order that they spoke, and then I'll be taking the general questions. So please do take the time to vote up the questions that you would really like to see asked, but none of those questions will be lost. We will make our best effort to answer those questions at the end afterwards in a follow-up blog post about the discussion here and about the webinar, including taking any follow-on questions from those that are watching later. We also have a chat feature in the Zoom. You'll see that it's possible to chat with other participants. You're very welcome to give a shout out hello to each other, introduce yourselves there. But as I mentioned, please do share your questions with us in the Q&A feature. We'll be taking questions at the very end of the webinar from there. So in this case, we will not be using the raised hand feature within the webinar call, simply so we can keep things a little bit smoothly running and not have connectivity issues between different people trying to activate their voice over perhaps sketchy Wi-Fi connections or internet connections. So as you continue to join us, we should hopefully have everybody not having too many connectivity issues. I'm going to stick in the chat the link to where we have the 2 documents that are produced so far, the Characteristics of Citizen Science and the notes to the Characteristics of Citizen Science. Please feel free to give those a read if you've not had the chance to already. I'm going to double check that I have shared that with all attendees. Here we go, I'll stick that there. I'll just wave a quick hello in the chat as well. You're very welcome to say hello to others in the chat. If you have the Zoom application on your laptop or on your desktop, you can go into the settings to add your photo, and that's a nice way for us to visually see each other even though the video is turned off. We have people joining us from all around the world. It's always fun to see where people are joining us from across a range of time zones. So as the number of participants continue to join us, I don't want to tread water for too long at the beginning of the webinar. We want to give our speakers plenty of time to start, plenty of time to speak. So I'm going to turn off my I'm going to turn off my screen share, and I'm going to start introducing to you who our speakers are for the day. So just to give you a bit of an introduction to our topic for this afternoon, the characteristics of citizen science. This was a piece of work that was launched on May 4th. And as I mentioned, there are two documents. There's the characteristics of citizen science, and there's the notes to the characteristics of citizen science. And the purpose of this is something that is hopefully useful for the wider community of citizen science communities. Within the EU-Citizen.Science project, where we're building the platform for supporting the citizen science community by sharing resources and by sharing projects, we ourselves were realizing that we had a need to define as clearly as possible what is citizen science, so that we can say, if you're sharing a project, it needs to be a citizen science project. We ourselves had the need to be able to say something quite clearly about what a citizen science project is, while taking care to be as inclusive as possible. So much of this work has come out of the EU Citizen Science Project, but it's also supported by ECSA and the members of ECSA, and a much wider community that became very active members of the working group. So what I'd first like to do is introduce you to our first speaker, who is Colombe Warin. One of the purposes of the characteristics work was to articulate what activities are citizen science, also with a view to supporting funding bodies and organizations that are supportive of citizen science. So they can say something clearly about what their criteria are and what their goals are in supporting citizen science. And Colombe Warin is a project advisor at the European Commission and works at the Research Executive Agency there. And she's overseeing a portfolio of citizen science projects within the Science with and for Society program of Horizon 2020. And one of those is the EU Citizen Science Project, where she is our project officer. So Colombe, I'd like to hand over to you now. If you'd like to switch on your share screen and share your starting slide with us.
Good morning or good afternoon, even now, everybody. So I'm very happy to be with you today and to present in 5 minutes, because I know I only have 5 minutes, what the perspective of the European Commission and why such characteristics of citizen science are important for us. I would begin, this is a definition, the importance of definition, but I wanted to begin by a kind of very quick history of how citizen science raised as an important issue for the European Commission. So as you know, we are working with framework programs. So the current one is called Horizon 2020. And at the very beginning of the program, for the first one, so in 2015, there was some work programs working specifically within Science with and for Society about public outreach and multi-actor engagement. It was not called at that time citizen science. But then in 2016, the Council recognized citizen science as an open science priority. And this is why, after the interim evaluation of Horizon 2020, there were specific calls about citizen science that were introduced within the part of Horizon 2020 called Science with and for Society. And more specifically, this arrived in 2018-2020 work program. I wanted to say about citizen science, the important is, of course, what are we talking about? And we put within the work program this definition that you see on the screen, that on purpose we wanted broad, because of course it's complex and it covers a lot of disciplines. And I know that Muki and Susanne will explain that very well after me. At the same time, we wanted to fund a very broad diversity of projects. I am, as Margaret just said, the project officer of EU Citizen Science, and this is what we call in our jargon a CSA, so a coordination and support action, meaning that we wanted this project to be a bit a hub of all the great citizen science projects, activities, initiatives that were flourishing within Europe. And that, I think we will talk later about the platform that has been just launched now in April regarding citizen science. So I will come back to that at the very end of my presentation. I wanted to just to give a glance of a few projects within this portfolio of citizen science that are 22 at the moment that we are funding, just to show the diversity of those projects. So the first one that was not called yet Citizen Science, but it was about public engagement at that time, DITOS, and Muki Haklay, I'm very happy he was the successful coordinator of this great project. I mean, it was really, for me, one of the pioneer of all the bunch of projects we are funding now in Citizen Science. Dinosis is a current project about other pollution. It's original, and it's also very linked to what we see in Citizen Science, is how there's citizens, research, of course, research protocols, but at the same time, an impact on policy making here about regulation, and it's ongoing at the moment. Action, another project, which is about really pollution again. The environment is a very key area for Citizen Science, but working with open cores, what we call in our jargon, again, I'm sorry for that, cascading grants, but really going to the ground, to smaller cores, to really reach the citizens. And finally, a brand new one that just began on the 1st of May, Crowd for SDG, which is about how to track progress about the Sustainable Development Goals. Just some examples of what is currently done about citizen science and around these 22 current projects. I wanted just to give a quick glance about what will happen under Horizon Europe, our new framework program for funding science. And indeed, in this new one, under what we call the cross-cutting part, which is called widening participation, strengthening the European research area, there will be a dedicated part for citizen science, responsible research and innovation, and science education. But at the same time, and I think it shows also the importance of citizen science, of understanding what it is and of characterizing what it is, there will be, within the 3 pillars that really that are here on your screen, also citizen science activities fostered in other parts of Horizon Europe. So in conclusion of my very short introductory short, I really look forward to hear Muki and Susanne, but I really wanted also to highlight what EU-Citizen.Science has just done. I mean, launching this platform, and of course, inviting all the participants to this webinar to have a look, and maybe, hopefully, to post some great citizen science projects and initiatives on this platform. Thank you very much. I'm done, Margaret.
Thank you very much, Colombe. That's fantastic, and well within time, even though we're off to a slightly late start, which is always the way as we wait for many people to join us. And it looks like the majority of our registrants have now joined us. That's fantastic. It's now my pleasure to introduce Muki Haklay and Susanne Hecker, who were very closely involved in this entire process in coming to the ECSA characteristics of citizen science. The effort was a very collaborative one, and it was a large working group that worked on this closely, but we're very grateful to Muki Haklay for taking some time, quite a bit of time in fact, off of his sabbatical leave to lead the structuring and structuring of this work and to guide the community throughout this work. So we've invited him to tell us more about the document and the process, and Susanne Hecker was also very closely involved. So Muki is a co-director at the Excites group at University College London, and they're one of the consortium partners in the EU-Citizen.Science project. And Muki is also the co-vice chair of ECSA on our board of directors. Susanne Hecker is an interdisciplinary science communication scholar at the Helmholtz Centre for Environmental Research. She's specializing in citizen science communication there, and she's also a member of ECSA's board of directors. So we're very pleased that both of them are joining us. And coincidentally, both of them were editors on the Citizen Science Innovation in Open Science Society and Policy book that was published back in 2018, which came out of the second ECSA conference. So both fantastic people to be representing the citizen science community. And I now hand over to you if you'd like to start sharing your screen, either Muki or Susanne, which of you would like to get us started with switching the shared screen from Colombe over to yourselves?
Yes, I will. Hold on just a second, please. I'll try this one. All right. Okay.
Fantastic. Yeah. Go ahead, Susanne.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Margaret, and hello from my side to everybody out there, wherever you are. I'm very glad to talk about this whole project, this journey of getting to know a bit more what the community actually thinks of what the characteristics of citizen science are. And as you have heard from Colombe and also Margaret also already in the introduction, the need for characteristics, that was, well, that's the first question that we are going to ask. How and why did we embark on the journey to discover the characteristics of citizen science? So what was the need and where did it come from? And we've heard that it came from policy side, but also from scientists, partners on the EU Citizen-Science project, but also the Open Science Policy Platform of the EU. And as you all know, there are many definitions that suit specific purposes, like, for instance, specific platforms, funding calls, or regulations. And the characteristics of citizen science should accommodate that wide range of definitions. So the aim of this journey actually was, or is, to provide a set of characteristics that can, and we emphasize, can be part of a citizen science project, and let people choose which set is fit for their purpose. So how did we approach this endeavor? I give you an overview now on those 4 points and we'll explain in more detail after that. So first we identified factors that influence people's view about an activity, for instance, the area of research or payment of activities. Then we developed so-called vignettes or case studies to expose the factor that we had identified within a typical context, citizen science context. We asked people, respondents of the survey, to grade from 0% to 100%. So 0% would mean, no, I don't think this is citizen science at all, or 100% would mean this is totally citizen science to me, with also the option for a justification or a comment on their decision. We reached out to people in research, science communication, policy, and the public to get hopefully a broad and wide range of views. So in more detail, what you see here is, or what I'm going to talk about, is the factors of citizen science. We developed 10 factors and 60 sub-factors, and we identified especially those where we thought there would be a potential ambiguity about the classification of a project. The 10 factors are first activeness, so that means how active is the citizen scientist involved. So is he or she very active or semi-active or passive? Second factor was the compensation. So is there a volunteer participation without any payment, without incentives, or with small incentives, or going up to a subscription fee, for example? The purpose was to ask, is this, is this a scientific purpose? Is the citizen science project designed towards a policy outcome, or education, or gaming? The fourth factor was the purpose of knowledge production. Was the purpose of the citizen science project a scientific discovery, personal discovery, maybe a local knowledge sharing purpose, or a commercial knowledge purpose? Professionalism was the fifth factor, where we included projects that gave no assumption about expertise by the volunteers, up to aiming at a specific set of experts for the activities beyond their work. Training. Here we had sub-factors like there was no training involved in citizen science, up to high skills or specialist training needed or expertise needed. Data sharing was another factor where the sub-factors range from open scientific research data up to voluntary personal data, or even public authorities data. Leadership was another factor where we asked who is leading the project. Is it scientists? Is it individuals? Is it a community? Is it public sector, commercial enterprise, or an NGO, for example? And then the ninth factor was the scientific field. So this included life and medical sciences, through all the ranges of scientific research, including social sciences, humanities, arts, etc. And finally, we asked about the involvement, at which stages of the citizen science project people were involved in this. Right. Second step, what we did was that we developed so-called vignettes. And we decided to choose a factorial study using those vignettes to explore individuals' beliefs and judgments about the topic. We created 50 examples of citizen science research activities, those vignettes, with some involvement of the public in one form or the other. And those examples were based on the literature on citizen science and public engagement in science. Some were created specifically for this study to highlight or pinpoint one specific subfactor that we wanted to ask people about. So what did those look like? This is one example of a vignette which pinpointed the subfactor of a subscription fee. So this is basically how all those vignettes look like. We give a little story, a case study. So Jane is a long-term supporter, etc., and she has to pay a subscription fee. So you can just read this for yourself. Another example would be this one, where we have included the subfactor of commercial services that are provided for the citizen science project. The structure of the survey, as I said, of the 50 vignettes, in total, 5 were selected to represent citizen science activities for which there was or is consensus in the literature on citizen science. For example, Galaxy Zoo, which is mentioned frequently in the literature as citizen science. And 5 to represent activities that are frequently mentioned as excluded, for instance, a one-way public consultation. We designed the survey in a crowdsourcing manner. That means that we accepted one or more answers by respondents, and the vignettes were shown to people in a randomized order so that we could make sure that all the vignettes are covered by people. And this survey ran in September 2019. And this is just a screenshot from the online tool, what it looked like. So you see at the top, you see the case study, the question, how confident are you about judging this case? Then the actual rating from 0 to 100%, and then the possibility for comments. So the results, I'm coming to the results of the study. We received in a total 392 responses. Of those 392 responses, 333 answered at least one case. And this is what you see at the left side of this graph. And we had 42 participants who answered all 50 cases. This results in a total of over 5,100 ratings, with the average of 100 responses for every vignette, and with more than 50,000 qualitative information data points. For the 80% where we can see the country of origin, because it was an optional answer, we see that the US, the UK and Germany are leading in responses, with a range of answers from across Europe. And half of the responses are from research, but we have also private companies, NGOs, people from the public sector and private citizens. We think that given the response rate and the mixture of responses, it gives us confidence that we captured a wide range of views from different fields of science and levels of experience with citizen science. We had only 7% of people who said that they had not, or they didn't have any experience with citizen science. So here I show you some graphs on rankings of the cases 1 to 15, or vignettes or cases 1 to 15. And it's a little bit small. I just gonna explain you on in each graph you see the rating. So on the left-hand side, it's 0%, and on the right-hand side is 100%. And on the y-axis, you see how many people voted this as, well, on the scale from 0 to 100%. As you can see, the views about the different cases show a very large variety of opinion, and this is not an easy this is citizen science or not case. The most distinctive case, and it's highlighted, it says crowdfunding, is the one in the middle at the top, where most of the people said, no, this is not citizen science, and we only had very little answers who said, yes, this is citizen science. Here are some other cases, 36 to 50. And you can also see that there is ambiguity in a set of distinct cases. The most distinct cases, or the citizen science project, was a project that was described as scientist-led, hypothesis-based, large-scale, and an open recruitment. But for the other cases, there will be some votes for 100 or for 0% and not exclusive votes. There are actually very few cases on which there is a strong universal agreement, and some cases are especially confusing. This is just another slide which shows the results of the confidence of people in rating the vignettes, as I have shown you earlier on the slide. And we can see that for some cases, the degree of confidence shows that only 50% find it easy. And there are very few easy to decide cases. Right, but now I leave it at that, because we are mostly interested in what the characteristics of citizen science actually are. And with this, I hand over to Muki Haklay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne, for introducing the study, and welcome everyone. So let me now take over. And I will share with you the last point. So when we look at the characteristics, the document itself, we have to remember that the whole purpose of what we are trying to do is that we're not trying to say there are, as Susanne just mentioned, people don't argue when it's large scale, scientist-led, hypothesis-driven type research. People will not argue about that type of thing as being citizen science. Also, when something has happened completely in the laboratory and require very expensive equipment and years of experience and can only done by experts, that's also won't be citizen science. That will be within the realm of the not citizen science. But what the survey has demonstrated to us, that actually the area in between, the area of ambiguity that is marked on this slide, is actually quite large. And that is what the characteristics document was trying to address. And it was based on the principle that we follow the views that are expressed in the document. And as we constructed them, we kept on looking at the result of the survey and making sure that we expressed a pluralistic view of the different positions. So that's what our aim is, not to describe everything that is citizen science, but identifying the area where it requires attention and guidance for people. And the document itself is broken into areas of core concepts. So I'll give you now a quick overview of the document. We'll look at the core concept, what we're trying to cover there, disciplinary aspects, leadership and participation, financial aspects, and data and knowledge. You'll notice that they don't correspond completely to the factors that we started with, and that's because we took the information out of the survey and then distilled it and worked together in an iterative way across the working group to identify the different areas. So let's look at the first area. The first area, the core concept, is we're trying to cover the concept. There is a lot of actually areas that get you close to philosophy of science and practices that require you to think carefully about the discipline and how a specific discipline operates in order to identify exactly what counts. So we have areas of what counts as research, intention and framing, purpose and aim, and other areas. Let me now show you the document itself. So if we look at the document, leaving aside the introduction, question that we are asking and we're trying to clarify in this part of core concept is to notice the issue that although we call it citizen science, actually people will call the activity research, especially in humanities, arts, engineering, and so on. But then also to say what we mean by scientific research and accepting that there isn't just one mode. And while some people in some scientific field will define only hypothesis-driven research as their definition of what scientific research is, we're pointing that a more pluralistic view is appropriate. We also point out very critically that actually a lot about citizen science is the intention and framing. You really need to think about what it is that makes the activity a citizen science activity in a specific field. And we kind of address that in more details. We also then go on to all the types of research activities that can happen. And all those things will be familiar to people in citizen science, but less familiar for people from different scientific fields. So if someone is not used to the fact that in ecology, there is a process of scientific database creation of a lot of species, they might think, no, that's not an activity that I would define in science, but it is. So we pay attention to those things. We also talk about the roles and responsibility of what people can take a role in, and point that in some cases it's really appropriate not to have a big role, and not again to try and think that there is only one way in which people can take a role. We point also to this almost philosophical concept of how we see the person that is involved in the project. Do we view them as a subject, or do we view them as a participant? And especially in areas that cover participatory action research or social anthropological research, we do need to pay attention to those concepts in order to decide if something is citizen science or not, and ethics comes into the framework of those issues. So that's our first topic. Our next section is looking at disciplinary aspect. So again, we started from almost philosophical concept, so we continue into paying attention to how different areas of research shape the activity and the research. So we talk about science and technology, arts, humanities, social science, and medical research. This is a part of the document that it's actually, if you look at it, it's got fairly lengthy paragraphs that are addressing those aspects of specific disciplines. So we're paying attention to starting from the scientific disciplines where citizen science is frequently well established and got a clear role a lot of time in contributory and data creation. But then we move on to talk about arts and humanities, to talk about the complexity of social science, and also to pay attention to an area that a lot of time doesn't receive enough attention in citizen science, about the complexities that medical science and human health research can influence in this field. The next section is now starting to move to practical aspects of project, asking who can lead the project and how that influence if the project can be called citizen science. And we talk about who can lead the project and pay attention that, again, there will be some people who would expect that it will be scientists who lead the project. And we have got responses saying so. But we point that sometimes it can be an individual leading a project on their own. Also, which type of organization can lead a project in order for that to be. And we have the degree of engagement, the scale of the project, professionalism and voluntarism, which Susanne mentioned, and the issue of education. And let's look at those aspects. So we start with who should lead the project, the individual, the community, or the research-led, pointing that different groups can do this work, but also paying attention to the organizational structure in which citizen science is happening. Interestingly, this is for me one of the more challenging sections, one that we need as a community to work on. In the survey and in the responses, we got very strong view about the role of commercial actors within citizen science area. And this section is expressing mostly the views that came out from the survey, but that means that when commercial activities or a commercial company is involved, a company is involved in the activities of citizen science, we need to especially demonstrate in what way it adhering to open science and to other principles to allow that to happen. There is also the degree of engagement about the fact that some people view activities as too passive or not including enough activity. And again, we define here to what degree that should be considered and under which conditions. We also talk about the scale of the activities and accept that in some cases it might be an individual doing that. Also the role of professionals, and sometimes professionals are active in citizen science, but outside the work time. And that's something that it's worth considering in our work. And the area of engagement and the boundary between science engagement and education and citizen science, and when something is not considered, but just in mostly an educational activity, is something that we pay attention. And finally, the links to decision making. So the policy-oriented citizen science, which again, in some scientific literature, people will have issues with perceiving it as a scientific activity, but it's part, as we see now around us. The link between science and policy is one that we shouldn't ignore. In other areas that was clear to us from the start that will require attention, and we gave it a lot of thought, was the role of money and payment. So this is in how it plays out in the project, and the section about financial aspects is providing us this information. So what we identified. If you've seen in what Susanne has shown you, there is the crowdsourcing case, and this is where we are actually saying about it. There was a very clear indication that that shouldn't be citizen science, and we take it into account. We talk also about payment to take part in the project and the incentive to participate in it. The final section of the document is talking about data and knowledge. They are at the core of scientific research, and there are multiple notions of what account to knowledge and what count to data, and so on. So we pay attention to these issues, including data and knowledge generation, data ownership, quality, how local and lay knowledge play out, different forms of data collection, digital data collection tool, and the sharing of personal and medical data. So let's look briefly at them and we'll finish with that. So paying first of all attention that different types of knowledge creation doesn't always involve just in the discovery area, but also can lead to policy relevant evidence that can be used in different cases. This is one that where data ownership in use is also can be complicated. An assumption that open by default is not always appropriate, but we're paying attention to that. We also pay attention to data quality, which we all are common with an issue that come up a lot regarding citizen science. We talk about the local and lay knowledge and the difference between just sharing it and actually making it part of the project. We talk about forms of data collection and providing opportunities for both forms of systematic and opportunistic. Something interesting that we identify is the complexity of data collection tools that can be perceived as survey tool or can be perceived as part of a citizen science project create. So we are paying attention to them. And finally, the sharing of personal medical data, which is linking us back to the disciplinary aspect. So this is a very quick overview of how the output from the project was actually leading to us. And I'll now hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Muki. That's excellent. It's hard to fit such a detailed, nuanced process into a reasonably short period of time. I'm pleased now to introduce our final speaker, Maaike Wijsploeg, who's working at the Museum for Natuurkunde. Her specialization is transformations of the science system, especially in the fields of citizen science and open science. But she's a member of the European Open Science Policy Platform, which advises the European Commission on the issue of citizen science, and participatory approaches as a core element of open science. And at the time that the consortium was, the EU-Citizen.Science platform consortium was embarking on this piece of work, a request came into us from the OSPP, which actually had quite an influence on the shape that the work took and the nature of the outputs that that both Muki and Susanne have introduced to us. So we've invited Maaike to tell us a little bit more about how this work relates to her work in the OSPP. So Maaike, if you would like to click on slide share for the slides that you've prepared, I hereby hand over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody, and thank you, Margaret, for the introduction. So I will share my slides. And introduce you quickly to the involvement of the European Open Science Policy Platform in the characteristics process. So I think the most important point here that it shows that the development of the characteristics is embedded in European science and policy making, I think, which is a very important step for the development of citizen science. So this acknowledgement of the broader science community and also of the European policy making area. So yeah, what is the OSPP? The OSPP is a high-level advisory group established by the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission, and it was established in May 2016. It's a group made of 25 expert representatives of European science stakeholders, and you see the stakeholders key here. We have universities and research performing organizations, research funding organizations, libraries, policy-making organizations, publishers, e-infrastructures, researchers themselves, scientific societies and academies, and then last but not least, citizen science organizations, which is in plural here, but yeah, actually it's only ECSA sitting here on the board. And for the first 2 years of this platform, Johannes Vogel, chair of ECSA, also chaired the Open Science Policy Platform. So we had a very good entree here into the area of European open science research policy making. And the role of the OSPP is, or it was, to advise the Commission to develop an open science policy agenda for Europe and support the implementation and find best practice examples. And it also functions as a dynamic stakeholder-driven mechanism for bringing up issues of concern for European science and research and the whole research community. And actually this, the citizen science characteristic process is a very good example of such an issue of concern. So, the involvement of the OSPP in the characteristics process was initiated by the European Commission, which on one hand asked ECSA for such guidelines, and on the other hand asked the OSPP to advise them on existing documents about citizen science, like the 10 principles. And the OSPP feedback was that, for example, the 10 principles were far too vague to inform, for example, funding policies in Europe. So that's where the process started. And the actual involvement of the OSPP was, had 4 stages. So the first was that OSPP members and their organizations participated in the survey. Second, we had 2 rounds of discussions during OSPP meetings. The third thing was that OSPP members commented on the draft. And it was here mainly the Global Young Academy and EATO, the European Association of Research and Technology Organizations, who heavily responded to the document. And the 4th step was that the OSPP endorsed version 1 of the characteristics paper. So, and to give you just very quickly, very briefly, an example of the feedback that came from the European Association of Research and Technology Organizations, because there we see what the issues are that came up there. And also Muki hinted that the economic impact and commercial application, that this area is deeply contested. So EATO said that yeah, if activities that are directed towards economic impact are excluded from citizen science, does it actually automatically mean that RTO, that research and technology organizations are excluded from the field of citizen science? So that was one of their questions, and it was then in the process reflected in the document that of course such an organization that is a public body is not excluded from citizen science, but that we have to then differentiate and reflect on the profit side of this. So that was very interesting. So, so just to give you a brief insight into the discussion. So yeah, and then I was asked to say a bit about the role of citizen science in the European science agenda. So tomorrow, the final report of the USPP platform will be published, and I give you the link here. It will be published on the EU website, and on the right side you see, yeah, a bit. So all these stakeholders were asked to give state of the art, and also for the area of citizen science. So from the report you can see what's the state of citizen science from the perspective of the stakeholders is. So and I think I already took my 5 minutes now. So if you have any questions, you can ask them later. Great. I stop the
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Micah. Thank you for sharing some of the conversations and discussions with us as well, because I think this whole journey has been really typified by a great deal of nuance and different lenses for understanding these various characteristics. We've had some great questions coming in the Q&A channel. I'm going to get to those in a moment. I have one question that I'd like to ask myself of all of those that were involved in the process, and that is what the next steps of the process are. And how can the people that are joining us here or maybe watching later get engaged in that process and join that process? So if I can hand back to Muki and Susanne for that question first.
So in terms of where we are with it, we now have version 1. And while we done a consultation, because of the timescale of the OSPP, we knew that our timescale will be truncated. But we see it as something that need continue discussion inside the ECSA community. So first of all, we would encourage everyone to read the document and also, of course, to read the explanation document. It is interesting, as I pointed earlier today, that when you look at the download statistics, it's pleasing that there were 300 downloads of the main document, but only 100 downloads of the explanation documents. So look at them in detail and give us comments, and we should open it up to consultation and to discussion, and to identify if something is missing, if we missed things like, for example, research performing organizations and other bodies that need to be included, disciplines and so on. And then we might move towards version either 1.1 or 2 or whatever. So that's an open invitation to continue and work on this. And also another small thing is that we want to know also how these things are being used and by whom. So if there are stories about if someone used it in some context, please let us know.
Fantastic, thank you, Muki. Would you like to add something to that, Susanne?
Yeah, just on a minor note, of course, there will be a scientific publication as well that we are currently working on. And for that, for instance, we are also looking at the comments that people gave to give us a better understanding of why they rated things like 0 to 100%. And we're doing a qualitative analysis on especially those cases where people where people rated them 0 and 100%. So where the rating quite differed a lot, because that's interesting to look at the comments that people give, the reasons for that. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I should also mention that the EU-Citizen.Science platform itself, in the next release, which will go live in September, will have a community forum, a community discussion forum functionality there, and we will definitely have a thread dedicated exactly to these discussions, so people can share their own experience and their views and how they're putting these characteristics into practice, because that will also be very interesting to see how usable they ultimately are for the goals for which they're intended. So we have some fantastic questions. I have a winning question with 13 votes up at the top of the list, which comes from Kathy. Did you identify any differences or similarities from a cross-country or cross-region trends perspective?
We didn't look. That's the short answer, is that at the first stage, we deliberately looked at the general result. What we were interested is to look at the general trends and to have something that is expressing the different views. There might be, and what we want to do is, after the scientific publication of the survey and the basic information, to open up all those wonderful resources, and then anyone can use them. From a very light look on the data, and it looks like that there are more in respondent people who are sticklers. I have a very clear and specific definition of their citizen science and exclude a lot of things, and there are pluralists, which I expected. I didn't expect it to have so many ambiguous cases, but it was interesting to see that. And that's something that is left open now to continue and analyze. So I can't say beyond that.
Was that data actually captured so that it can be analyzed later? Did I understand that correctly, Muki?
Yes, all the data of the survey will eventually be released on Zenodo. We said it from the start that everything will be released. We hope that the vignettes also can be used extensively. So all this stuff should be open and follow the open science principle.
Fantastic, thank you. Our next question is from Julia. Is it correct that the study was only conducted in English? And do you think that that had a limiting effect on the diversity of study participants? I'm seeing Susanne nodding. I think that's a yes, that it will have had a factor.
Of course. I mean, that's in a region like Europe with so many different languages. Of course, you kind of limit the reach if you only do it in English. But at the same time, we needed an approach, a feasible approach to do the survey, and we knew that we could reach a large audience with doing it in English. So that was the decision to be made, and we didn't have the time, and also that would have needed some more consideration of translating this into different languages, and yeah, it was just not feasible.
And just to say also that if someone wants to work with us on translating the survey and run it, well, probably we'll be very happy to support such an activity.
Thank you. We've got a really interesting question from Rick, and really it's one to open up to the wider community, although we just have our speakers able to answer at this moment, but I hope to hear more answers in the chat. And Rick's question is, do colleagues think that the different future we're about to move into will shift some of these processes and methodologies and decision-making in citizen science towards the citizen and the volunteers?
I think I can take this one. Okay, so I managed at the European Commission a bunch of different projects of citizen science, and indeed, since we had this crisis of COVID-19, we have seen a kind of adaptation to citizen science projects to a more online. I mean, like the one we are living in at the moment. I'm sure Muki has more clear example about that, but I have seen that in many of my projects. I think it's too early now to know if it's a shift that will really continue along the years, or if it is temporary, or how it will affect citizen science, which we know is really about citizens, as we have talked, although it's in the research process as well. So I think I can just say that it occurs. It's too early to assess it, but I'm sure I think other panelists have a view to share about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I jump in here as well. Maybe from a more meta level perspective as well. What we can see, for instance, through surveys in that I've seen results in Germany, but also in Italy or South Africa, people in the COVID-19 crisis tend to trust more in science, which I found very interesting. And also if we see and as I'm coming from a science communication perspective, for me, that's fascinating to see all those kind of media heroes popping up in all those different countries, and scientists that are listened to and whose advice is taken very seriously in these times, also by not only by policy, but also by society. It links to the wish of people to be more involved in science, and many people have given that answer in, for instance, in surveys in Germany, but also in Sweden. And we don't know yet, maybe, but I could imagine that we have a chance here to involve more people in the scientific process through citizen science, and thus through collaboration also increase this trust in science, and also show people the uncertainties that are linked to scientific research and to results, but also to increase that literacy in society. But we don't know yet. I think it's a chance.
Fantastic, thanks so much. That's clearly a greater discussion. Micah, do you have
just
comments as well?
Because I think it's still important, so that, to start differently, that the push for more citizens involvement and to take up these the engagement of the people still needs structures and funding. So that's where we have to work towards, because the change we see now and the surge in citizens' activities and involvement may not be sustainable if we don't create the institutions and the places and spaces for these kind of activities. So I think there is hope, but still we have to work towards it, and it's something we can take into our institutions and do this. And I can say for the Museum of Natural History in Berlin, we are putting our full effort into this kind of structure building with all the partners that are involved here.
Fantastic, thank you, Maike. So we have a lot more questions than we're going to be able to ask now. These questions will not get lost. We'll share these with the speakers after the fact, and we'll pick up the answers in a follow-up blog post after the webinar. And the webinar will be available online. I'm going to take one part of the final question, that's at the top of the list, from Julia, who's asking a little bit more about the nuance. She asks, I would be interested in hearing a bit about the reasoning participants shared for their decisions on the vignettes. And can you already share some insights from that analysis? So I think we might not have time to share some of those insights right now, but if you could say something about how those nuances and insights that will be shared in the steps that are coming up.
Yeah, so as a final thing, I'm showing you actually a case that it's almost, well, it's not almost, it's very relevant to the situation right now. It's actually a vignette about someone participating in an epidemic study that was used by the UK government within the modeling of the COVID-19. And within the vignette, if you look at what we've done, we both looked at information about how many people voted yes or no, but Susanne pointed that there is this rich information that came with it that actually tell us why people found it in defining it or not, and we could actually analyze it and give the information about the different people. And all this information is the basis for the paper. Unfortunately, I am kind of trying to progress while dealing with the lockdown on the paper, but we do hope to progress quickly and then to release all this information, and you could easily look at it. Susanne might also add a line about the qualitative analysis.
Yeah, but it's as Muki said, we've gone through the most diverse cases, and why people have made their decisions. It's funny enough, some take the same argument for saying this is citizen science to me or it's not citizen science to me. So they say, oh, the person, for instance, is not actively involved, or just a minimum of active involvement. So some people would say, oh, this is too low as in terms of engagement. For me, this is not citizen science. And others say, oh, at least the person is involved a little bit, and it helps science to progress. So sometimes it's really the belief or the opinion of people on the same argument to say it's citizen science or not. But of course we're gonna do more of this analysis with the publication, and and also go into more detail with that in the coming weeks.
Indeed, there's enough subject matter here to do another 2-hour webinar, diving into the details of each of these vignettes and the subtleties and nuances. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for coming and joining us. Thank you so much, Colombe and Muki and Susanne and Maaike, for speaking about this work and the impact that this work will have and where it will be put to further use. And also a big thank you to our team in headquarters at ECSA, Barbara and Helen and Shimona and Tim, who've been helping out behind the scenes, setting up all of the technology, keeping us organized and running smoothly. We're learning these technologies along with the rest of you. So I think there's a fantastic learning curve for us, and hopefully the start of more webinars that will come from the EU-Citizen.Science project and from ECSA. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Please don't hesitate to continue to shoot us questions over Twitter in the CitSci webinar hashtag, or join us on the community forums when they launch on the platform in September.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.